Excellent. Well, I'm delighted to welcome you all to M&G for the launch of the Better Lives Index, the latest research from the ILC. M&G has been a proud partner of ILC, working together to produce insights in the impact of longevity on our society and developing solutions to ensure we all live happier, healthier, and more fulfilling lives. In 2024, we supported the ILC as they produced a report on the strengthening of the intergenerational contract, which has been an integral part of British society for the last 70 years. The pension and investment industry has a critical role to play to ensure the process continues where each generation supports other generations when they can and receives support when they need it. And M&G is helping the next generation savers ensure that the bond remains strong in the face of changing economic and demographic trends. Our £130 billion with profits fund and its smoothing mechanism is critical to this mission, navigating the ups and downs of the economy to benefit all savers, and investing directly in the communities where these savers work and live. The Better Lives Index is another important contribution to the ILC, an online tool that brings together key measures of progress, including life expectancy, economic activity, and avoidable mortality to track the best and worst places to be born, grow up, grow old across the UK. It will enable us to explore the insights behind the data to identify areas for intervention, highlighting trends over time, and support the policy improvement, giving better outcomes at every stage of life, in every place. Thank you all for joining us today to discuss this timely and important piece of work. I will now hand over to Lawrence Churchill, Chair of the ILC, who is going to lead the session today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Clive, and thanks for M&G for hosting us today, and to Hallmark for sponsoring our event. Last week, I was reading Dr. Ken Ditchwald's keynote address for the US Aging 50th Anniversary Conference, and I'd like to share some perspectives with you on that. Longevity, said Ken, is the most extraordinary change to happen in human civilization. Throughout 99% of human history, life expectancy has been less than 18 years old. So all of the problems and the challenges we are now facing are completely new to mankind. Last year, for the first time ever, there were more citizens providing elder care than childcare. And when Franklin D. Roosevelt, back in the 1930s, chose age 65 as the retirement age, there was 25% unemployment in the USA. His priority was solving youth unemployment. Excuse me, not retirement planning. Now, these are just a couple of examples of both the enormity of the change and how social systems become anchored around dates and around concepts which are no longer as relevant as they once were. In the UK, we're at a pivotal moment. The country spends more than it earns. Borrowing costs are higher than they are for our peers. We leave the labour market too early. Investment is low, and productivity forecasts have just been reduced. Longer lives are more often viewed as a liability rather than an asset. But these challenges are also opportunities. Longer lives can bring significant social and economic benefits if we make better decisions about health, work, and community. Inequalities abound, and the one-size-fits-all policy solutions inevitably hit problems. The UK Better Lives Index, supported by Hallmark, Pfizer and Edwards Life Sciences, provides a snapshot of how people are living differently across the country. It's a powerful tool that brings together data on income, health, well-being and opportunity to allow us all to see where people are thriving, which challenges remain, and how local and regional differences shape outcomes across the life course. Today, we're going to explore what the index tells us about these differences, the opportunities to improve lives, and how policy and action can reduce inequalities. I'd now like to hand over to Anna van Rennen from the ILC to present more on the index. Anna.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, and thank you to everyone who's attended today. I've been working closely on this project with my colleague Ben, who you'll hear from later, so I'm really pleased to be able to share the findings today. So, we know that across the life course, where you live really shapes your life. And globally, the UK performs quite well when it comes to certain economic or health measures that are relevant to longevity, but internally, the benefits of those longer lives aren't being felt by everyone. We've got massive spatial inequalities in health, wealth, and opportunity across the life course. And tackling those inequalities needs evidence and long-term planning. And that's where the UK Better Lives Index comes in. So the index was built to measure 359 local authorities across the 9 metrics that you can see on the screen, which measure better lives as we are born, as we grow up, and as we grow old. We created the index by first ranking each local authority individually on each metric. We then added those rankings together to produce a final score, and that final score gives us the overall rankings. Now, I'll just show you how the tool works. So this is how the web page looks. You can see at the bottom there's a scale that shows you the color coding of best to worst. At the top, there is a button where you can toggle to view the map by metric. If you hover over a place, you can see the overall rank and the metric rankings, and if you click on the place, you get some extra information. So we've got the population and the quintile rank, and then we've also got the metric rankings and the metric values, each of our indicators. So what have we actually found? So these 2 maps show the top 20% and bottom 20% performers on our index. We can see that the top 20% is quite concentrated in the south of England, while the bottom 20% is more spread out across Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, the Midlands, and the North England. Now, within these groups, there's obviously some variations. So, for example, if we look at the top 20%, in the London boroughs, they perform quite well on economic indicators, but perform less well when it comes to avoidable mortality, child poverty, and housing costs. And we can see the same variation in the bottom 20%. So some areas in Wales, for example, do really well on life expectancy, but perform less well when it comes to income and pollution. What does tie together the bottom 20% of places is that many of these areas have long been categorized as highly deprived. So this demonstrates that our index does align with established measures of inequality and deprivation. We can see here the correlation between our index and the English indices of multiple deprivation, as well as our index and universal credit health-related benefits in Great Britain. And we did this because we wanted to make sure that the index reflected reality. So we can see that areas that perform worse on our index have higher levels of poverty and deprivation. And this tells us that the index isn't just this abstract measure, but it really is capturing real inequalities across the UK and highlighting how they persist across our life course. So let's look at some of these inequalities. We know that life outcomes vary dramatically across the UK. So life expectancy at birth, there's a 9-year difference between the top performer, Richmond upon Thames, and the bottom performer, Blackpool. Child poverty averages just 12% in top performing areas, but in some lower performing areas like Oldham, Pendle, and Bradford, it exceeds 40%. And we found that avoidable mortality is almost twice as high in lower performing areas as it is in the top performing areas. We've also found that income and unemployment gaps are persisting. So household disposable income in top areas is over £10,000 higher than in bottom areas. Economic activity for those over 16 is 68.8% in the top ranked areas, but just 57.4% in the bottom ranked areas. Economic inactivity sees a similar gap when it comes to 50 to 64-year-olds. What we have found is that housing is more affordable in lower ranked areas when calculated with the house price to earnings ratio. But this sort of reflects economic stagnation as opposed to economic prosperity. But we didn't just create the index to highlight all these challenges. We also want to use it to think about solutions to these inequalities. So we did a little bit of analysis and we found that if all areas match the employment rate of the best performing place in their peer group for 50 to 64-year-olds, the output for this would be £109 billion. Perhaps more conservatively, if everyone were to match the average employment rate, it would add over £19 billion to our economy. We do know that health is a big barrier when it comes to economic activity, especially as we age. So supporting good health and good work are both important if we think about turning longevity into an economic strength area. We've also done some analysis on the 10-year plan and avoidable mortality, as well as the new industrial strategy, which is available in a paper on our website. So I'd encourage everyone to go visit the website and read our paper. So the index shows where inequality persists, but it also shows where there's potential for improvements and investment. And we really believe this is a tool that can support inclusive growth, longer working lives, and better health outcomes, no matter where you live, no matter what age you are. So I would encourage everyone to give it a try, see how your area ranks, and visit our website to read more about it. Thank you.
We're now moving on to our panel discussion time, but you can see already, I think, from Anna's presentation, what a hugely powerful index this is, really data rich. So I do encourage you all to mine it and follow your own areas of interest to explore this a little bit more. But I'd now like to invite our panelists, please, to come up and take their seats on the stage. We're joined by Susan Halliwell, Chief Executive of Bracknell Forest, Sundar Katwala, Director of British Future, Chris Pond, Chair of the Financial Services Consumer Panel, and Ben Franklin, Deputy Chief Executive at the ILC. I'll give you just a tad more about their background as well. I mean, Susan is an experienced local government leader with nearly 20 years in the sector. She's held senior roles at Oxfordshire County and West Berkshire Councils, leading major initiatives on infrastructure, regeneration, climate action, and organisational transformation. Sundar Katwala leads British Future, focusing on identity, integration, and opportunity in modern Britain. He previously directed the Fabian Society and worked as a journalist and leader writer at The Observer. Chris Pond has long championed consumer rights and social justice, serving on public bodies across government and academia. Former MP and Work and Pensions Minister, he continues to shape policy on financial inclusion and innovation. And finally, Ben oversees policy at the ILC, focusing on ageing, economic inequality and inclusive growth. He previously led the Centre for Progressive Policy and has advised government and industry on economic and social policy. So I'd like to start with you, Susan, if I may. Your local authority, Bracknell Forest, ranks 4th in our overall in our index. Can you tell us about what's contributed to this success?
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me here this morning. There's nothing better for a local authority chief exec to talk about their place. I'm really happy to be here. The success, I think, of Bracknell Forest, I think if you think of Bracknell or if you think of Bracknell Forest, some people might think, well, where is that? But new town, and it's got a reputation of being a new town where government plans the World War II, and over time the reputation of being quite run down, and so if you think of Bracknell, you think of a new town, lots of roundabouts and a bit dreary. Actually, it's not the case at all. The clue's in the title, Forest. It's an amazingly diverse place. It's located with amazing connectivity, any forms of connectivity, whether you're looking to go global and get to Heathrow, the road connectivity, but equally, as a new town for Bracknell, it was designed for 50-minute neighbourhoods. And so you see these communities that are really connected. And I think that might be a theme coming out of the conversation, is that it is a place where we have very distinct identities, whether it's the village of Crowthorne, Bracknell as a town, or the communities within Bracknell. People really identify with their place. They identify with their local communities, and they support each other. And we as a provider of services really see that particularly in Bracknell town. As the communities were built out as part of the new town, those communities have very strong identities and support themselves, particularly as you get older. And we see that as a local authority in terms of our spend. I don't know how much more you want me to go into the benefits of Bracknell Forest.
Well, just 30 seconds to a minute, perhaps, Susan,
okay.
And then that would be great.
Well, the other thing that I really kind of want to make sure that people are aware of is that we have at least 150 open spaces across Bracknell Forest. We're not a big place. But 20% of the place itself is protected with some sort of environmental protection. We have a lot of accessible green spaces, and people use them a lot. We also have a lot of open green space that is associated and has benefited from growth. And that's something that I wanted to convey today. Particularly, I'll cite Bucklers Park is a new development in a place called Crowthorne. It's a strategic site. It's still being developed out, but right next to it, we developed Bucklers Forest, which is part of an old transport research lab. And it is one of the most diverse sites in not just Bracknell Forest or Berkshire, but in the southeast for its biodiversity. And in a very, very short period of time as well. And I think that really goes to show that if you're planning places properly as they grow, they benefit the place, they benefit the environment, they benefit the individuals. And I think it's a really good hallmark to kind of focus in on.
Wonderful, Susan. Thank you very much. I mean, you've clearly got the advantages of being new, but you've taken control of those advantages, and let's see whether your theme of connected communities does really come through as a theme across all of our speakers. But can I turn to you now, Sunda, and ask you about inequality? And because often debates about inequality seem too easy to polarize between old and young, rich and poor, north and south, and so on. But what can policymakers learn about building common ground and a shared vision for fairness and opportunity?
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's difficult because these are quite polarized times. They're very anxious times. They're quite fragmented times. There's quite cacophonous sort of way we talk about politics. This is happening in all Western democracies. These are changing societies. They're getting older. They're getting more diverse at the same time. So it'd be relatively easy for me to say what a common ground society would feel like if you lived in one. You'd have fair chances and no unfair barriers, whoever you were and wherever you lived. You'd have an equal sense of your sense of voice, a sense of mutual respect in your society. Well, if I paint that picture, you can see in the data you've got, you don't live in that society. And so while in principle, if we put the kettle on and said we don't really want to get as polarized as America, let's talk it through, people would agree fair chances for everybody, fair chance for every place, fair chances for my group and for other people too. But lots of different people feel unheard for different reasons at the same time. And so policymakers are always stretched at the national and the local level. So I think you've got to work very hard at doing that. Well, one interesting thing is that between the young and the old, actually, when we ask people, what do you feel divides us, it ranks quite low. And you might think, why doesn't it rank higher? Look at the data. The young should be upset about it. The reason it ranks quite low is that everybody has got intergenerational relationships in their life. It's actually impossible to live in our society without having that. So you might see big divides between families that will inherit and pass things on, families that won't inherit and pass things on, but there's very little appetite for an intergenerational clash. There's just more of an appetite for a clash with London or the city 20 miles down the road, or with the other group we don't feel part of. So it's interesting to think about what do you have to do in the conversation to make people feel they will be heard, but they've got to accept that other people will be heard equally.
No, thanks very much. And I mean, as part of that conversation, that really is about connecting people, and your experience is that when they're connected, the polarization begins to moderate.
Yes, and there's so I mean, we just did a big State of the Nation exercise that was coming out of the riots of a year ago, and there's a big cohesion commission that I'm part of. Very, potentially very anxious time. There's very much hope at the local level. People feel a sense of pride in place almost everywhere. The difficulty is knitting up above the local into the regional, into the national as well.
Yeah, excellent. Well, let's hope that the index can help demonstrate some paths forward there. But Chris, can I bring you in now? And again, if we look at something like pensions credit, I mean, the claims vary very widely. I mean, 39% of people in Tower Hamlets, I think, claim pensions credit, but only 4% in Hart, which is number one in our index. And so I think that reveals inequalities in financial security. So what stops people achieving stability in later life, and what could help them build resilience into the way they plan?
Well, I think the first thing, Lawrence, I have to congratulate ILC for a tremendous piece of work, a fantastic tool that you've created here. And it really struck me looking at some of the results. I came back from Oldham yesterday, which is, you heard from Anna's presentation, has 40% child poverty rates. A few days before that, I was in Harrogate. Now, Harrogate is only 50 miles away from Oldham, slightly less than 50 miles away, but I'll tell you what, it's got rather lower, I suspect, child poverty rates than is the case in Oldham. And when we talk about the common purpose, it seems to me that we all have a shared interest in getting this right, in reducing those inequalities, because all the evidence is from around the world, as well as from in the UK and the USA, is that inequality is very expensive. It reduces the overall level of economic growth because economic activity for significant sections of the population is lower than it could otherwise be. And Anna gave us the figures there. I think it was 19 billion increase in overall economic activity, which could be generated if you had a levelling up agenda, even to the average, let alone to bring everyone up to the top. But also, if you look at crime rates, or you look at the issues that happened with the riots so recently, all of these things, the health indicators, they are all worse in more unequal societies. And therefore, that means it's worse for all of us. It's not only for those on the pension credit or the families suffering child poverty. All of us pay a heavy price for living in an unequal society. And so where we see this drive against the EDI initiatives, you know, equality or equity, if you want to call it that, diversity and inclusion, that started in the States but is now drifted across the Atlantic, as a former colleague Malcolm Wicks would have said, soggy on arrival in the UK. We are seeing this drive backwards towards inequality, and that is something which I think we're all going to pay a heavy price for.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, thank you, Chris. Ben, can I turn to you? And I mean, the index shows stark regional differences in healthy aging, in opportunity and financial security. Which patterns surprised you when you looked at them? And what do they reveal about structural inequalities in the UK?
Well, I think, you know, one of the things that our index reveals is the depth of the inequality, and Anna's great presentation showed that really strongly. I mean, just looking at the bottom and top quintiles, the bottom and top 20%, there's a £10,000 average household income gap. I mean, that's absolutely massive. Life expectancy inequalities, the avoidable mortality gap, so, you know, deaths that could be avoided with better timely healthcare and public health, nearly double. You know, I think the problem for the UK is that we've almost got used to these numbers. You know, we've almost been like, well, you know, the healthy life expectancy is 20 years difference. And, oh, okay, but that's not what we should be used to. You know, and so it reveals, I think, that the social and economic playbook that we've been utilising for the last 20, 30, 40 years has failed time and again. And obviously we've had and played lip service to certain different sorts of reforms. So there was obviously the levelling up agenda under the last Conservative government. There was the regional rebalancing at one point in time. There were all sorts of initiatives during the New Labour era as well. And I think one of the things that strikes me thinking about the starkness and stickiness of those inequalities, which our index reveals, is that growth may be necessary but not sufficient. Actually, if you look at the relationship between our ranks and gross value added per head, for example, it's there, but it's not overly strong. You know, so actually, perhaps some people in some industries are doing well within places, but not everyone. So I think it's really important. The government has these missions, and growth is obviously number one for government at a national level. But we have to remember opportunity being an absolutely vital one, and the distribution of that opportunity, especially at a time when, you know, our productivity levels might be only 0.5% or 1% per annum. So thinking about how that's distributed, I think, is absolutely key to making progress on this agenda.
Well, thank you, Ben, and that really illustrates, I think, how difficult some of these challenges are that we face. But Susan, can I come back to you now? And I mean, looking ahead, what are the biggest challenges or risks that could affect well-being and opportunity in your area, in Bracknell Forest? And how is the council planning to address those?
Well, I mean, I recognise everything that everyone has just said, and I think looking ahead, the immediate challenge for Bracknell Forest is the new funding formula for local authorities. We will have a funding reduction in the next years, and so it may be that we move to an unstable financial position during that period of time if we can't cut our cloth accordingly. That's a real challenge, because where the demand is coming through is children and adult services, particularly adults, and what we see in the long term, the trend is particularly around dementia and the cost of that. The other challenge, I will say, is climate change and the impact that has on our services, on our communities, and the cost of change, and who funds that, and how we transition to a net zero economy. But within every challenge, there's obviously an opportunity. And I was speaking earlier on to colleagues that working in Bracknell Forest is an absolute privilege, because the colleagues I work with just see the solution in a lot of. One of those moving to more of a community-based model, and we see that I mentioned around the Newtown community spirit that exists, rolling that out across the whole of Bracknell Forest, really enabling, supporting and empowering communities to be resilient, to make sure that we are looking after our own, and the authority is really the last call, the last resort. And I think actually we see that happening anyway. So for us as Bracknell Forest, I think we're in a strong position. I think in other places there's going to have to be greater investment.
No, okay, thank you, Susan. And just listening to you there, it seemed to me you've got great advantages in building further the community-based model. But oh goodness, it struck me as being a bit unfair, because you weren't an area of deprivation at the moment. You're having a budget cut, you know. So, is there a drive towards forcing people down before they can then get the right degree of political health? But I don't want you to answer that now. That sounds a bit political and off script. Sunda, can I just turn back to you, because you mentioned fairness before, and very often public consent for tackling inequality often rests on trust that the change is going to be fair. So do you have any lessons for us from British Future's work on the work on identity and immigration that could help shape support for place-based action? I mean, how do you make it feel fair to all of the different parts of the community?
Well, I mean, there are some quite simple lessons that are common sense if you say them, but you've got to do them as well as say them. I think a perception of fairness is very much about a sense of voice and whether you feel heard, more than it is actually about whether or not the specific outcome happens to be fair to you or not. It won't particularly feel fair in a relatively affluent place to have less to get by on, even if there was a fairness argument for it. And so, you know, listening to the Bracknell Forest experience, well, you know, we have to make these everywhere issues, that we have to be proactive everywhere. I think sometimes we see sort of inequalities as a high deprivation issue and cohesion as a high diversity issue, and actually everywhere has to manage the pace of change in the way that's right, For it, it's about clarity and simplicity of language. You know, the way that EDI has been communicated makes a lot of sense if you work in it. It doesn't make a great deal of sense if you talk about respect for everyone that is different and fairness for everyone and doing things together and having a shared culture. You're not then being pejorative about maybe advantaged groups. You're not saying, you know, you can, you know, people feel actually that exercise like this are good for women, good for racial minorities, good for sexual minorities. That's good, but they're actually meant to be good for the culture of everybody. So you've got to get clarity about that, and then you've got to follow it through and show that that is the case. Just one thing about what we measure, I think what ILC does is really good here, because it's in your DNA to look for sustained stamina, look for longevity in this. You know, if there was a benefit of Brexit, people debate the costs and gains, but it was that we had a conversation about spatial inequality by realising how polarised and divided we are. But it's very hard for our political culture, our media culture to do that. So measuring it and showing it is important. There's a gap in what we measure and what we don't measure. We're very, very good at measuring objective facts about life expectancy, about incomes, about poverty. We're not very good at measuring sentiment, about how people feel heard or unheard, what people feel about the different groups in their society. Am I warm? Am I indifferent? Am I fearful? Am I hostile? And actually, we've got to put those together actually more if we want to get both the place-based and above it right. It's about bonding is the hyperlocal. Locally and nationally, you need to bonding and bridging. You get a lot of cohesion by people sticking to themselves and being distant from other people. I think it's the job of leadership to make sure people are bridging as well as bonding.
Yeah, no, very, very important points there. Chris, I mean, you've just been appointed as the chair for the Centre of Finance, Innovation and Technology. So how do you see financial innovation contributing to financial inclusion. I mean, can technology genuinely improve financial inclusion across all regions, or is there a risk it could widen the existing inequalities?
Well, there's always that risk, Lawrence, isn't there? But it seems to me that if we take Ben's point about growth being necessary but not sufficient, I agree with that, and I would refer back, if Anna will forgive me, to a term used, Anna, which was inclusive growth. That's the sort of growth that we need, which means that when we talk about fairness, and I will come to your question in a moment, Lawrence, I promise, but when we talk about fairness, there will be a lot of discussion over the next 3 or 4 weeks as we run up to the budget about whether various measures are fair or unfair. And the difficulty is that if you use fiscal measures, i.e. spending, whether it's local authority budgets or whether it's taxation, then you are bound to get groups who think that's unfair because an extra burden's been imposed on me, or groups that feel that they haven't received as much as they should through this form of fiscal redistribution. Whereas if you used a model, which I have to say was used very much by the 97-2010 government, which is about addressing the inequalities at source. So the minimum important part of that, getting people to work as people, providing more economic activity across the board. All of that reduced the inequalities without necessarily it appearing to reduce the living standards of other groups in the population, which is inevitably what you have to do if you only use fiscal measures. Now, one element of that will be, and now I come to answer your question, I'll do it briefly, is about inclusion, financial inclusion in particular. We've got 20 million people in the UK who struggle to access financial services, by which I include the million who don't even have a bank account. The millions more who don't have access to insurance, including home contents insurance or motor insurance. And I recently stepped down as chair of the Financial Inclusion Commission. We went around the country talking to people about what was the lived experience of exclusion. And in Northern Ireland, young people said to us, we cannot afford car insurance. That means we cannot get a job, because if you live in Northern Ireland or a rural area, you can't get to work unless you've got a car and you can afford the insurance and the maintenance costs. Similarly, on savings and pensions, millions of people are excluded. Now, I'm hoping that in the next few days, and I looked anxiously at the press this morning to see if it had yet been announced, we will have a national strategy on financial inclusion, which is a government-led strategy. And if that is an ambitious strategy, which helps to bring that 20 million people back into the world of economic activity, we could generate an extra 25 billion in economic growth. Can innovation help? Absolutely. It already is helping in later life in terms of the way that people can manage their incomes in later life, their choices on pensions, the dashboard that will soon be with us. All of that is really important. And also because financial services, in a legacy sense, tends to be designed to meet the needs of people as if we were still living in the 1950s. You know, the assumption that people are going to be in work and probably in the same job for most of their lives and will therefore build up a pension through that, which will see them through without the need for a resource to pension credit, etc. That isn't the world in which people now live. And fintech and financial innovation is one way in which you can shape the provision and the delivery of financial services to the needs of people as they lead their lives today. It can be much more flexible than is the case with legacy financial services. And I'm not just talking about the new fintech firms, I'm talking about the way that innovation is being used by legacy financial services. So I'm very hopeful that it will be positive, but you're right, Lawrence, in flagging the fact that there could be a risk that it would just further widen the gap if we don't make access to that technology available across the board.
Yeah. So the key is access for inclusion. Ben, can I just turn to you again and ask, how can we use the index to highlight hidden inequalities that might be missed by traditional economic or health metrics? I mean, Sundar's already mentioned measurements of value, measurements of emotion and so on. Can the index tell us anything about that?
I think where this index is really important is it's trying to be holistic. So rather than looking at health specifically, or looking at the economy specifically, or labour markets specifically. We're trying to bring together serious outcome measures at a strategic level to support planning, to create a baseline in order to create change. I think one of the things that I think is quite an important finding from the index, and there is some variability in this, but at an average level, those places that are doing well for young people are doing relatively well for old people as well. So where we see areas with low child poverty, there's London being an interesting one, whereby you kind of economic well-being is relatively strong in terms of household incomes, but child poverty is high. So there's some exceptions, but generally speaking, across the life course, actually, if a place is doing well for young people, it's also doing well for older people. And so I think that has an important implication for public policy. And what we're trying to get at with this index is the real importance of integrating both social and economic policy across the life course within a place. That's what this is really getting to. And obviously this index is a snapshot in time of outcomes. Where we want to go further is to understand, well, why do places change over time? How can we tap into different sorts of interventions to influence and improve or change those outcomes within a place over the future? And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that later, and Stephen's going to talk about next steps for the index. But certainly, that is that holistic approach, looking across different local authorities at a UK level as well. Obviously the indices for multiple deprivation came out last week. That's only England, whereas we can start to look and benchmark across the UK as a whole, which I think is an important addition that our index provides.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Ben. Now, I'd like to sort of end our discussion today by asking everyone, very briefly, if you could answer in just one sentence, please. For years, we've been hearing about levelling up at local areas, and we've had mixed progress. But if you look ahead for 5 years, what's the one thing that would be real progress for you? And Susan, I'll start with you.
I would say the rollout of the community model, and seeing that enabled across every local authority. So it's the left shift, so left shift to prevention.
Thank you very much indeed. And Sunda?
I think there's a real danger of fatalism. It's just too big to fix. So I think the thing that will make most difference would be realisable, practical things that we know what works and we can apply more of them. It's about the capacity to connect in that bottom 20% map. And I was very struck by how clearly that's a 4 nations challenge when you look at that. And so there's more connections to be made about how there be people to invest in that aren't there at the moment yet, the investment communities.
Okay, thank you. And Chris?
And for me, predictably, it's this focus on inclusive growth. We're not going to get an improvement in living standards anywhere in the country without further growth and productivity, but it has to be inclusive, and that therefore means the National Strategy of Financial Inclusion, when it is published, is going to be a major element in the Levelling Up campaign.
And finally, Ben.
Yeah, I'd agree with Sunder's point there. Actually, we know what works in certain places. The Greater Manchester model, on the whole, seems to have improved productivity, seems to have improved life expectancy through this integration of health, social and economic policy and devolved powers to enable that to happen. We need to create an environment where we can deploy that at scale to prevent health problems from emerging and to ensure economic activity for all the population, not just a select few.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd now like to open up the discussion, first of all, to 3 contributions from the floor, and then sometime, you've all been looking forward to it, for some Q&A. But first, I'd like to bring in Tom Rhodes from Pfizer. There's a microphone in your seat. Sorry.
That's better. That's better.
Sounds good.
I can hear me. So my question was around the opportunities with intergenerational collaboration, learning as a means to make some of these improvements. So from a sort of a health perspective, we know from experiences in other countries that particularly around things like vaccine confidence, that actually you sort of drawing on learnings from older people who have experiences of, you know, infectious diseases that today are rarely seen is a real benefit to improving vaccine confidence. That's one example, but I wonder whether there's missed opportunity there, and it was referenced that actually the conflicts are less between the generations, so perhaps there's an opportunity there. So I just wonder whether the panel have reflections on whether there's specific opportunities or more general kind of thoughts on that theme.
Okay, Tom, let's find out if they've got any views, shall we? Anyone want to volunteer to go first? Opportunities for further intergenerational. Susan, you look as if you're...
I'm happy to, just because we see much further intergenerational connectivity. There's less reliance on us as a local authority. So the question for us is, so to what extent from local government do you intervene in that and encourage it? And what's your role in that leadership space to make that happen? I was talking just the other day with our exec director of people, elderly individual for the local authority in that space. But had they have done something, there could have been a different outcome. And so there's something that we need to do through a community model, through that connectivity piece around enabling it and encouraging it.
Okay, so I mean, the good synergy then with your community model, I think. Now, you've mentioned intergenerational stuff, Sunda, already. I mean, would you like to pick it up? And from what the work you've done, do you find anything going into the health space as well, as Tom asked about vaccination approaches and so on?
I mean, vaccination was powerful because the power of being invited was important, and that's a contact story. Look, the intergenerational debate we tend to have, for very good reasons, is about very tangible things, about wealth inequalities and how you can afford to buy a property. And we're missing, I think, a really big part of the intergenerational conversation that we need. If you want to share a society and to feel you share a society, the most important thing is to have some kind of shared account of how is our past, our present and our future linked. How does the future we want relate to the past we've got? And there's enormous appetite for that among young people and old people, but you've got to see it happen if you want to reassure them. For example, I'm doing a lot of work around the traditions of remembrance. We've got our poppies on now, the armies that fight those world wars. They look as diverse as today's Britain. Old people are very committed to that tradition. They're not sure young people will be. They find it incredibly powerful if they do that. So you can build more sort of symbolic confidence in the society you've got if you actually have an intergenerational conversation about how our place has changed over time, what everyone in a school should know, what people who arrived here in the 50s and 60s can tell young people about that. And there's a warmth to that actually then gives you some social capital with which to work on these knotty fairness and distribution issues.
Thank you. And Chris, Ben, do you want to come in on this one? Or
yeah, I think just kind of linking to your point, Susan, around the importance of communities in this. I mean, we know that certain community-led interventions do work, right? And we've seen that. The Sure Start is the classic example where, you know, holistic interventions within communities and community-led are absolutely critical to that success. And you know, clearly they can be multi-generational, and that will obviously be a part of them being community-based. Similarly, the New Deal for communities under the last Labour government is now shown to have changed the dial in terms of some of its impacts that it had. The challenge for today's world is that we don't have the level of spending power that we had in the 2000s, and so we need to be even more innovative in thinking about the community models that we can scale for today, bringing in the voluntary sector, bringing in local assets where there are those local assets, in order to shift the dial. And who are the local assets? Well, they're people. You know, and investing in people locally is absolutely critical to this.
And Chris, enough of you, or?
Very briefly, there is a bit of
on the intergenerational divide.
Yeah.
Access to etc. My generation have done so much better than my kid generation, they're teens. And I think he ended his book by saying, be nice to your kids, they'll be choosing your care home. And, you know, but there is, that divide has become wider. I think, and I apologise, my former colleague Nigel Waterson in front there, it was really brought home to roost with the Brexit debate. You know, it was the older generation Brexit, and it was the younger generation who were paying the price for that. That's the only political point I'll make, I promise, Lawrence. You know, we have got a mountain to climb, but I am optimistic that although we're only in the foothills of that mountain, we can rebuild that partnership between the generations. And we talked about innovation. That is an area in which a younger generation really can support an older generation in accessing the services they need.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Chris. And Tom, I hope that's a good answer for you. But can I also take the opportunity to thank you and Pfizer, I think, for the support that you've given to building the index as well. Thank you very much. But next, I'd like to bring in Karen Tyrrell from Drinkaware. Carol, do you have a statement or a question? Question. All right. Yeah. Yep. Okay, no, thank you, Karen. Great question. You know, how can the data in the index inform new models of delivery? Now, that sounds like a question meant for you, Ben, so we'll do you first, but you actually run local stuff. So, Susan, I'll be on to you next.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. I think it's, you know, what we want to do with this index is obviously this is a snapshot in time, and it's an important, reliable snapshot. But what we want to do going forward is to understand, so what changes? How do places change in their position over time, and why? And in particular, what are the factors within place that mean that even if there are certain structural characteristics, why they seem to be better than others? And so that's the next kind of crucial phase of work, is understanding that, thinking about the different tiers of activity that we can do in terms of health prevention, whether that be the sort of primary tier, what does your housing look like, what does transport look like, what do jobs look like in a local area, down to secondary and tertiary level prevention, including the public health initiatives in local areas and how good those are. And I think there is an opportunity for us to connect this data analytical work in with obviously two big initiatives that are happening within government. So one is absolutely the neighbourhood service, and we can question the extent to which that's really being pushed out and scaled out. You know, there's 40 odd areas, but not a huge amount of seed funding for some of that, and whether NHS really believes in that model, but also making sure that that's connected to other government initiatives such as Pride in Place. And for those areas that, you know, they aren't part of the lucky however many neighbourhoods that might be, what do we do for people who aren't included in some of those? And how do we ensure that activities that are working in those specific areas are scaled up to areas, including in Bracknell Forest, where there may be struggles and challenges as well?
That's a great link to Susan, I think. And
so for me, the index, the tool is just gold dust, and it's come at just the right time, because so many structures are being adapted, changed, ripped apart and start again. You've got the formation of new strategic authorities, you've got the scaling up of integrated care boards, and we're part of one of them, so we're becoming a Thames Valley ICB instead of we're moving out of Frimley. That creates a huge amount of opportunity actually with this data to really think at a local place level, and that's the challenge, because the Strategic Commissioner for Health is becoming more strategic, very much removed from the place, removed from the local authority. If you've got a strategic authority already in place, then the scrutiny of the health function is being proposed to move to the strategic authority, their oral strategic authority. So the role of local government becomes even more important. And as you were talking there, I just thought health and wellbeing boards. They're the ones that are responsible for the neighbourhood health plans. They need to use this data, and because health and wellbeing boards represent the whole system in that place, and it will be so important for them to really use this and mine the data. I'm not sure I like that phrase, but really get down and really use it to define exactly what's needed in that place.
Thank you very much, Susan.
Yeah, there's danger as well, of course, to this kind of index, very useful, though it is more so if government does it perhaps than if it's done in civic society. We rank everyone 1 to 369. It's not brilliant to be told you're 360 or 369. So I think that has to come with a commitment to saying here's the support you get, and because you've got it toughest, actually we're going to learn from what you do, and we're going to spread that, and there's a sense of sort of respect and empowerment in how you do that. So you go to Blackpool and you make sure that happens. I think we've seen some of that in Bradford over the last decade with the university, with local government, about health inequalities in Bradford, about specific challenges in a place of particular high diversity, and just having the evidence, and so not so much being sort of stigmatized in the national debate, but actually having control about what's being done about it. So I think it's very important with these kinds of rankings to make sure that localized, empowered approach is seen to be applied and felt to be applied by the people you rank lowest.
And Chris, do you want to come in on this one?
Just very briefly. I agree with everyone else. Some fantastic tool which can help us address so many of these different issues. And I used to be a trustee of a thing called GambleAware, sister organisation Drinkware, and I now chair a thing called GamStop, which has got 650,000 people signed up to self-exclusion problem gambling. And the point here is that this tool can be used, I think, to really focus on a number of those issues which are related to deprivation. And I hope very much that the board will take on board the issue about alcohol addiction, gambling addiction as well, and problem gambling. This is not to say that gambling per se is a dreadful thing, but we have got a real problem in problem gambling, and it's worse in those areas of deprivation.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Chris. So Karen, I hope that's interesting thoughts for you to feedback. Thank you for stimulating question. Can I invite you, Nick, to come in finally from the floor? Yeah, we can. Well, personally, I'm absolutely convinced of the need, but I'm not on the supply side. So I'll turn to you, Susan, I think, and say, housing that really suits the lifestyle of the future older generation. And how does that get into planning? And are you doing anything in Bracknell Forest on that issue?
It is, short answer, yes. Longer answer. I think it goes back to that growth agenda, doesn't it? And understanding what is feasible in the place, responding to the housing targets that are set, and making sure that each place has that ability to ensure that it's designing for the future and the future need. There still perhaps isn't always the level of control that, control is probably too strong a word, but that leverage that local authority may want to make sure that some new developments are coming through that do actually meet the need and aren't just attracting inward migration from people because actually it's on good connectivity lines, and so you get a different cohort of people moving in. I think there's also a point around adapting. So understanding the housing stock that you have and enabling and encouraging the shift. Even down my road, there are, I can already think of at least 4 or 5 really lovely family homes with retired individuals or couples that love their place. They love, and why are they still there? Because they're connected. And actually, I will pop round and just make sure they're okay, or I'll water their plants when they're away on their holidays. But actually, maybe in the future there might be something better for them locally that still enables them to be connected with that community, but frees up that family home for other families. So I think it is definitely part of the planning process. Whether we're brilliant at it, probably not across the board.
Okay. Any thoughts on housing?
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of agree wholeheartedly that that these massive, broad national targets, A, they're never delivered anyway, and B, they don't take into account the real importance of getting the right housing within place. And I think that's got to be our focus, and whether our future work with this index can start to tap into that based on projected trends for households over the next 10 to 15 years, how that then interacts with some of the other outcomes that we're interested through this index. We can potentially provide some interesting insight around that, and keen to get your, everyone in this room, their thoughts on how we can then utilise that in order to make it as useful as possible to Susan and others within local government in terms of supporting the planning of housing, for sure.
Okay. Sandra, any
Yeah,
thoughts on housing?
I think it's a very good example of a broader point, really, that housing is relational. If you get it right, can get in the way if you get it wrong. I think there is probably a trade-off when you're going for volume and pace that you might underweight that. You obviously don't want to put the brakes on, but there are, and the Bracknell Forest example, it tells us there are opportunities of the new. If you're intentional about relationships while you're doing it, there are actually opportunities to design in the right things for a society in which older people will be working more, and you want different kinds of connections than you might have expected.
And Chris, you referenced in a previous answer that we're still designing for the society of the 1950s. I mean, is it the same for housing, or how do we get future focused?
I think it is. I think it is, Lawrence. It's not only about the number of houses, that 1.5 million that we're aiming for, but it's the quality of housing, because so many people, whether they're older people or families with young children, are living in housing which is such poor quality in terms of its energy efficiency, it's damp, it's really not very pleasant. And there is a drive which hasn't got as much coverage as I think it should have, which is to invest in improving the quality of people's homes, making them more energy efficient, because so much of the carbon problem that we face is from owner-occupied housing. It's a very large proportion of it. And if we had better insulated homes with more efficient, lower carbon means of generating their energy, then we'd be both driving towards net zero more quickly and dealing with issues such as fuel poverty. And so forgive me, Lawrence, for slipping into a different hat, but I chair something called Trustmark, which is precisely trying to do that, to ensure the quality of those installations, whether it be solar panels or heat pumps or insulation or whatever else it happens to be. Let's not forget there's a lot of housing which could be brought back to proper use if we improve the quality.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. I'd now like to open up the question and answer session to everybody. A few instructions. There are built-in microphones in the backs of the chairs in front of you. If you could please say your name and any organisation you're affiliated to. And if your question is directed to just one or two of the panel members, please say who they are. And I don't need to say the next one, which was, can you use the traditional manner of indicating you do want to ask a question by raising your hands? I can see 3 or 4 already. So can we take the first one, the gentleman on the right? You probably do, I think, for the noise to carry.
Switching on, I'm getting a... Can you hear me? Oh, sorry, you keep your finger on it. Apologies, well, others can learn from that. Thank you, Lawrence. I'm Ian Philp. I was the National Director for Older People's Health and Care under the Blair government. I'm now an older entrepreneur with my company called Aged Care Technologies. And my question for the panel relates to not just longer life, but better life in old age. We know if you're poor, you're much more likely to die young. But if you do have the fortune to live to an older age, whether you're rich or poor, you can spend many years with a poor quality of life. So that, for example, more than 40% of people aged 75 and above living at home suffer from chronic severe pain. And more than a third suffer from extreme levels of loneliness. Yeah. So the question for the panel really is, how do we not only address the inequalities around length of life, but how do we help people that live into late old age have a better life?
Okay, no, thank you very much. You said the question was for the panel. So I'll look for volunteers to go first. Susan's nodding again. And I think the question is really about quality of life, not length of life.
Yes, and I think that from a local authority perspective, we very much rely on the voluntary and community sector. And that the point that you make around isolation and loneliness is so important. And actually, if we can get people out and get people volunteering, get people engaging, and going back to that connection piece, that's what we're looking to do, because we know then that they are less likely to have an issue at home. You know, they're less likely to need our services. So how can we enable that infrastructure in the community? I think there's always a challenge in identifying. You know, I think our counsellors, they'll tell me stories of, you know, they'll be door knocking and they'll suddenly come across a lady who, you know, has been living on her own for X number of years and the cupboards are bare and she hasn't had any help, and she just answered the door at the right time and they were able to come in and get the services to her that she needed. So for me, there's something on a very micro local level around how you make those connections and how you know your community, and you can make sure that you know, we don't have those stats that you've just articulated there. The challenge around that is, I think some of our places are better at it than others. I think Bracknell Forest is a really good example, where you've got communities that aren't used to engaging. You might have a cul-de-sac who lives in a cul-de-sac and never spoken to their neighbours. You know, that's real. You know, and that's the challenge I think we have at a local level.
Okay. Anyone else want to take this?
I think with the King's Fund at the moment, and that's looking at different healthcare systems and around the world. And one example is the Swedish system. And while there are some regional qualities is weakness as well. But what we need to do really well is at a community level, that outreach. That outreach both from, not necessarily would even call it social care, but having that level of support multiple times a day to go into people's homes to support those who might be family carers as well as the individuals that live in those homes. So that kind of neighbourhood level approach is absolutely critical, I think, around this. I think to get politicians and Treasury interested in quality of life is also about to draw the economic argument about why that's necessary. So obviously there's the NHS costs side of it potentially, but there's also something about how can we support older people to consume within their local areas, and how do we support demand locally as well. And I think our index and analytical work could potentially play into some of that too.
Obviously, when we think about quality of very later life, there are some things where you want to have intervened much earlier in preventative things, and there are things that remain in our power now, and the loneliness and contact points are much more in the second box. I mean, when you look at the loneliness data, it skews very young in terms of who feels lonely, as well as skewing very old. So there's an opportunity here. I think that the challenge really, if we're talking about 10, 15, 20% of society, is normalising the offer and the invitation, so people don't need to identify themselves, because they will always say someone else must be in a worse position. So if you can normalise a level of contact that wasn't there, nudge people into it, I think, you know, perhaps we need a better frame than loneliness.
Yeah. Okay. Chris, any thoughts?
No, just thank you for powerful statistics there, especially on the loneliness end of things. But I would just underline again about the quality of people's homes, and Susan's point about the role of the voluntary sector, which is so important in reaching out to so many people. I speak as somebody whose sister has been has worked with Samaritans for 4 decades, and the story she can tell about breaking down the loneliness that so many people face when they really feel there's no other option is hugely important.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So there was a hand, a persistent hand even, from the lady just in front of me towards the back. You want to pick out your microphone from the... Oh, you've got it.
I
Good.
have. I'm ready.
Excellent.
Juliette Collier, I'm a director at Campaign for Learning, and we run the National Centre for Family Learning, and I've been really interested to listen how many people have been talking about intergenerational learning. But my question is, because we've done work with the Money and Pension Service on financial inclusion, intergenerational, with the Hallmark Foundation, Open University on health and well-being, but actually it always seems quite marginal. There aren't kind of mainstream drivers, funders, all of that stuff. You're kind of linking either to an adult agenda or a child agenda. And so my question is, how do we build a real focus on intergenerational work, on working together, rather than it being an accidental thing that you do on the margins? And secondly, and linked to that, how can we make sure when we're doing it, we see the families and communities that we're working with as a really positive resource that can actually benefit all of their community?
Okay, wow. So how do we make this mainstream, I think? And who'd like to kick off?
I could have a brief stab at that one. I think, in a sense, I think we do adult learning in general really badly in the UK. I think learning is seen as education for young people, as distinct from across the life course. So one of the big things for adapting to an older population and longer lives is about how we can extend learning across the life course. And I think a lot of this also comes back to community. Where are those kind of community hubs where we could hold some of these activities? I think you know, a shout out to the Big Local, for example, that does some quite interesting and innovative, very hyper-local interventions, which sometimes is about skills training, and some of that is multi-generational, you know, actually in areas and pockets of high deprivation and maybe high levels of unemployment. So actually, if someone who has been in a trade or something but knows the skills that are necessary for people who are economically inactive, they can support them into that particular transition. And then having that then linked into formal educational services, I think, is the next key in order to be able to scale that up across a local area and a region, which is happening to some extent, as you say, you know, not across the board and not at the scale that we might want to see.
Something I always notice is that we talk about education when we're talking about a child, and we talk about skills when we're talking about an adult. Yet when you're talking about, for example, the neurodiversity agenda, talking about special educational needs, you have amazing skills, but you're not great at test, an exam, but your test, that's like your educational career as a child. Yet they have the most incredible skill set in the workplace and will very much be needed as we move on when we think about AI and we think about what the new skills will be that are required in the workplace. So for me, is breaking down that divide. Exactly as you say, and I think I'm going to use your word around inclusivity. How is it truly inclusive? And how can we start thinking about what we need for the future and for whomever? Because it could be the 60-year-old that had always planned to retire at 60, but actually has realised they've got maybe 30 more years that they could do something. So what can they do? And they've got all these skills or this opportunity to reskill or re-educate themselves in something, and giving them the avenues to be able to do that. So maybe, you know, a reshaping of, I read the other day, I think there's talk of having an A-level around AI and how, and bias within AI. Well, great.
Yeah.
You know, I think we all need that, particularly with misinformation and disinformation these days.
Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a well-made point about how it can be a bit marginal, a bit sort of fluffy and nice to have, or very instrumental. Interesting, if we get normal people together, sort of median citizens together, and ask them how to have a more cohesive society, the same common sense points just come up everywhere. Different people tell you different things. Obviously, a shared language is really foundational. That's obvious. And then after that, people think mixing in schools, not segregated schools, helps. Places we need to mix beyond schools really help, and we've got to try and disagree better, but we're not very good at it. People aren't quite sure how to do that. The internet is the problem. And I think there's something really interesting in the places we meet and mix, what we do with them and how we do them more holistically. Because in terms of, you know, mixing in schools, actually schools have done really well. We've actually got big intergenerational shifts towards more confidence in our society about tolerance and diversity, because there are more relationships at a younger age. We therefore need to use schools as places we meet and mix for parents and grandparents, as well as for children or other things we're doing, sure start centres as intergenerational opportunities. But I think just being a bit clearer about what the gains are that aren't purely instrumental would perhaps help us to mainstream it more.
Okay. Final thoughts from you, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely important to try to get away from this divide between skills and education, and the notion that education is something you do in school and you never do it, and later on. And the family learning model, which, as you say, Money and Pension Service is very effectively developed, is so important in that respect, because we have such a shortage of skills in this country, to use that terminology. I talked about improving the quality of people's homes. The problem is that we've got an aging population with those skills. They're not upgrading the skills, and you've not got the flow of younger people coming into those trades, because it's not perceived to be, particularly prestigious to become a plumber or an electrician or whatever. So we have to do to break down that divide between education and skills. Down the notion that if you're prep or skills learning or whatever, that's somehow going back to school and it's not very grown up. We've got to get over that. And on Susan's point about neurodiversity, I do an organisation appropriately about autism, which recognises people who are also on the autistic spectrum, but those who are at the further end of that nevertheless have a huge amount to contribute in all of these different areas. They may lack certain skills, but those are more than made up for in other skills. So to have a situation where 14% of young adults who are classed as autistic being in employment is a terrible waste. What about the other 86% of those young people who could really make a fantastic contribution, especially in a world of AI and of the digital world which we're all living in? Those are the skills that you need at the moment, and we need to find a way of giving people the capacity to move in and use those skills in an economically active way.
Okay, thank you, Chris. There's a concentration of speakers, I think, on that side, so I'm just going to go to the person on the outside there. Thank you. Unfortunately, we're going to run out of time very shortly. We've got tons of questions, so I'll try and think about a way in which we get them in. But please.
Thank you. I'll keep it brief. Chloe Smith, I'm chair and trustee of various things relating to technology and hearing loss, and also president of CIPD, which is the professional body for the people profession. So my question is whether the panel thinks there is a role here for employers revealed by this index. What should the CEO and the chief people officer in an employer in any of these places be doing?
Excellent. Thank you, Chloe. So a nice simple question, hopefully simple answers if we can, panel. What's the role of employers in helping us solve this problem? Who'd like to go first?
May I?
Chris? Yeah.
Very briefly, making the business and the economic case for EDI. You know, that employers know that they're going to get productivity gains from inclusion and for involving a more diverse workforce. Let's get that message across, because we're losing that argument, and employers are the people who can make both the business and the economic case for it.
I agree with that, and I think the way to do that is to make sure that fairness across class lines, fairness across geographic lines isn't in competition with gender equality, ethnic diversity, but is part of a holistic thing. I think if people can then explain why inclusion is the business of business and then go out and defend it, they don't then have to hide under the table because they're accused of doing political things they shouldn't do when they're actually doing what is good for their business and its role in society.
Yeah.
Okay. Ben, I'll come to you next.
So one of the bits of analysis underpinning our index is around the industrial strategy, and we revealed that those areas that have high levels of employment in frontier sectors are already doing relatively well. So I think there's a key role here strategically for regional government leaders as well as national and local to think about, well, how do we ensure that the benefits from investing in those frontier sectors get down to those people and places that would otherwise be left out, as well as ensuring that where there's foundational sectors that are high employers are offering good work, because that is clearly an absolutely critical component to unlocking the opportunities for all of this.
And Susan, as an employer.
Well, yes, and also, so the first answer that came into my head was move to Bracknell Forest, it's a great place to live. But the proper answer is what the panelists just said, but also thinking about the role that business has in investment in the area. So yes, move to Bracknell Forest, it's a great place to live, but actually, we're talking about the levelling up agenda, if you're talking about looking at the areas of deprivation, it's really getting to understand how we can.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So can I invite you to just email your questions either to Anna or to Ben at ILC, and we'll get back to you with the thoughts, and if we can circulate through the panel to get combined responses, that would be great. And I'm just delighted that we've engaged so many interesting points of view for you to feed back to us and want to continue this conversation. It's a great start. This conversation is not going to stop anytime soon. But can I thank you now, or ask you to join me in thanking the panel while they return to their seats. Right, so what happens next? Well, following today's discussions, we want the UK Better Lives Index to be a tool that drives action. As Anna's already mentioned, we're already carrying out some secondary analysis of policies like the industrial strategy and the NHS 10-year plan, and now we want to use those insights to help shape real change. Our next major output alongside the index will be the project focused on alcohol-related harms in collaboration with DrinkAware. And we're also taking the index forward through two main work streams. The first on prevention, We'll look at local prevention gaps across primary, secondary and tertiary tiers of the health service. We'll model interventions and identify areas for improvement to guide policy and investment. The second is on financial resilience, where we'll measure financial vulnerability. We'll model net wealth at the local level, link it to wider well-being and capture effective local solutions to inform local decision-making. Our aim is for the index to guide local decision-making, helping councils and regional bodies focus on the areas that will make the biggest differences to people's health, well-being and opportunities. We want it to inform national policy as well, highlighting where inequalities persist and where targeted interventions could create meaningful impact. And above all, we want it to spark debate and collaboration, bringing together policymakers, practitioners and researchers to explore solutions that deliver better lives for everyone, wherever they live. Did anyone mention a big conversation? About time we had one. I'd now like to hand over to Stephen Burke from Hallmark, who've sponsored today's event, and we thank you very much for that. If we'd invite you to close our session today. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Lawrence, and good morning, everyone. Today really does mark the end of the beginning for the Better Lives Index. It's been a remarkable worldwide adventure already, starting some 3 years ago with the ILC's ambitious and pioneering Global Healthy Aging Index, ranking 153 countries, and obviously here today launching the Better Lives Index for the UK. Hallmark Foundation has been delighted to support both these ventures as a founder funder. Back in 2022, it was a leap of faith by our trustees, one of whom is certainly with us today. It was a leap of faith by our trustees, but it's certainly borne substantial returns since then. And now, really, there is no going back. The challenge is, as we've heard very well from our panel today, is how we use those indexes so that aging well becomes common globally and nationally for all our citizens. The indexes enable policymakers to ask the right questions and to identify solutions for healthy aging. And we need to do much more, obviously, around prevention, what really works in terms of prevention, and around reducing inequalities. And real music to my ears from the panel today about the need for more mixing, sharing, and connecting between and within communities. But there are many other issues that need to be explored further, and that gives real opportunities for other funders to come on board. And I'm delighted to hear about DrinkAware's work, for example. Hallmark Foundation is particularly pleased that the index and the ILC take a life course approach to aging well. That means investing in early childhood, prevent parenting, and Best Start as it's now called, ending child poverty, and getting aging well on the school curriculum. But of course, we shouldn't stop there, as again we've heard. Learning goes on throughout life. Today, though, I'm also pleased to share that the Hallmark Foundation is funding other projects that engage young people in aging well, reduce loneliness among school students, and support intergenerational aging well activities between and learning between younger and older people, as you heard from Juliet already, as well as a number of projects that look at midlife and beyond to increase economic and voluntary activity and prepare for different life challenges, some of which, again, we've heard about, whether it's alcohol, gambling, or dementia, for example. Finally, it would be remiss of me not to mention again the importance of other funders coming on board. The Better Lives Index and the plans for taking it forward and digging deeper offer real opportunities for funders to support evidence-based policy making and practice. The ILC has a great team to work with, as we heard from Ben and Anna today. Please sign up to help improve the health of the nation and to create longer, healthier and happier lives for all. Thank you for joining us today. Many thanks to M&G for hosting us, and of course the ILC and all our speakers. Please use the last few minutes to carry on networking. Thank you very much.